The first thing I noticed as I pulled into my driveway was the golden stretch of crops swaying under the evening sun. My land, which I had left barren before my long trip, was now fully farmed. Neat rows of vegetables, towering cornstalks, and freshly watered soil. Confusion turned into rage as I stepped out of my truck, my boots crunching against the gravel. Who had done this? Then I saw the signs. Small wooden boards stood proudly among the crops, each painted with Karen's farm produce in neat, cursive letters. My hands tightened in two fists. Karen, my nosy, self-important neighbor, who had spent years whining about everything from my fence height to the sound of my tractor. Now, in my absence, she had taken it upon herself to claim my land and turn it into her personal farm. I walked further in, anger bubbling in my chest as I spotted more proof of her trespass. A makeshift irrigation system ran through the field, feeding the crops. Bags of fertilizer with her initials on them were stacked near my barn. A set of plastic lawn chairs and a sun umbrella were even placed near the tool shed, as if she had been running a business here. It was unbelievable. Not only had she planted an entire farm on my land, but she had the nerve to mark it as her own. I could already hear her fake, sweet voice defending herself. "Oh, but you were gone. I didn't think you'd mind. You should be thanking me for putting your land to good use." My patience snapped. If Karen thought she could take my land, farm it, and keep the earnings, she had another thing coming. I wasn't going to waste my time arguing or sending legal notices. If she had the right to plant it, then I had the right to collect it. And that's exactly what I was about to do the next morning. As the first light of dawn stretched across my land, I was already at work. The crops that Karen had so diligently cultivated were ripe and ready for gathering, and I had no intention of letting them go to waste. With a determined mindset, I started with the cornfield, moving row by row, pulling down the golden ears and tossing them into the truck bed. The rhythmic sound of picking filled the morning air, a satisfying contrast to the simmering anger that still boiled inside me. Karen had treated my land as if it were hers, planting crops without permission, tending to them as if she had any claim. But today, I was taking back what was rightfully mine. The deeper I ventured into the field, the more evidence of her hard work surfaced. The perfectly spaced rows, the carefully placed irrigation lines, the small storage bins where she had likely sorted her harvest. All of it screamed of an operation that had been running for months. She hadn't just borrowed a small patch, she had practically settled in. The sheer audacity made me shake my head in disbelief. How had she been so confident that I wouldn't return? Or worse, that if I did, I would simply let this pass. By midday, the first phase of my plan was complete. The truck was overflowing with corn, squash, and tomatoes, and there was still plenty more to gather. A brief break gave me time to plan my next move. The small wooden signs that claimed Karen's farm produce were still scattered around the field, standing like mockery on my land. I pulled them out one by one, stacking them in a pile near the fence. She had marked this land as hers, taken ownership in my absence, and had been waiting to profit from the harvest. What she didn't realize was that she had only done half the work. By late afternoon, I had loaded up the last of the vegetables and turned my attention to the barn. Inside, I found another surprise. Bundles of prepacked produce neatly arranged in crates, ready to be sold. Karen had already started supplying. I let out a low breath, realizing just how far she had taken this. It wasn't just a hobby or a casual experiment. She had been running a large-scale farming operation on my land, harvesting crops that weren't hers and selling them for a return while I was gone. The sheer audacity of it was almost impressive. Almost. Without wasting time, I loaded the prepacked crates onto the truck as well. If she thought she had secured her revenue, she was in for a rude awakening. As the sun began its descent, casting long shadows across the field, I took one last look at what was left behind. The empty fields, the discarded signs, the remnants of her failed empire. There was something deeply satisfying about knowing that every bit of produce she had counted on was now in my possession. With a final glance at my land, now free of Karen's authority, I hopped into my truck and drove toward the town market. If she had planned on selling these crops, I figured I might as well beat her. The idea brought a smirk to my face. She had done all the planting, watering, and tending, and now I was about to enjoy the rewards. The town market was already bustling by the time I arrived, the scent of fresh produce mixing with the crisp fall air. Vendors called out to customers, displaying their fruits and vegetables in neat arrangements, while buyers negotiated over prices. I pulled my truck into an open space near the main stalls, stepped out, and took in the scene before me. This was where Karen had likely planned to sell her stolen harvest, but today, I was the one who would benefit from it. I got to work quickly unloading, crate after crate, stacking them neatly on a wooden table I borrowed from a nearby vendor. The sheer volume of produce was enough to attract attention. Fresh corn, plump tomatoes, bright green cucumbers, all harvested at the peak of their quality. Curious shoppers began to wander over, inspecting the vegetables with approving nods. Within minutes, I had my first few sales. As the transactions continued, an unexpected yet satisfying thought crossed my mind. Karen had unknowingly done all the hard work. For me, she had tilled the soil, planted the seeds, nurtured the crops, and kept everything alive while I was away. And now, all of it was paying off for me. Every bill tucked into my pocket, every empty crate stacked behind me, felt like justice being served. As the morning stretched into afternoon, a familiar voice cut through the air. I turned just in time to see Karen approaching, her face twisted in disbelief, then fury. As she laid eyes on my stall, she stopped dead in her tracks, her gaze darting from the vegetables to me, and then back to the nearly empty truck. Realization dawned across her face, and for a moment she simply stood there, speechless. I continued selling, ignoring her presence, though I could feel her seething rage burning into me. She had likely arrived expecting to set up her own stall, only to find her entire harvest gone, already being sold under her nose. A customer handed me cash for a bag of corn, and I handed it over with a satisfied nod. There was something immensely gratifying about knowing she had just witnessed the success of her own stolen effort, but in my hands, where it belonged. The market buzzed around us, oblivious to the silent war unfolding. She clenched her fists, her lips curling as if she were about to explode, but instead, she spun on her heel and stormed off toward her car. I watched her go, knowing full well that this wasn't over yet. She wasn't the type to let something like this slide, but that didn't worry me. I had played by the rules. She had invaded, stolen my land, and turned it into her personal farm. I had simply taken back what was mine. By late afternoon, most of the produce had been sold, leaving behind only a few stray crates. I packed up, counting the day's profits with quiet satisfaction before heading home. As I pulled into my driveway, I noticed Karen's car parked outside her house, her shadow visible through the window as she paced back and forth. She was likely scheming her next move, fuming over the fact that her plan had collapsed so completely. I knew her type. She wouldn't go down without a fight. But she had made the first blunder by assuming she could take what wasn't hers. And if she thought she could get away with it, she was about to learn that consequences had a way of catching up. The next morning, just as I expected, the storm arrived. A loud knock shook my front door before the sun had fully risen. I took my time getting to it, already knowing who would be standing on the other side. As I swung the door open, there she was, Karen, arms crossed, eyes blazing with rage. Even from a distance, I could see the strain in her jaw, her shoulders squared like she was ready for a confrontation. She thought she could win. Her presence wasn't surprising, but the fact that she had come here so soon only confirmed what I already knew. She wasn't just angry, she was frantic. Her accusations came fast, words tumbling out in heated bursts as she pointed a trembling finger toward my land. She ranted about how I had stolen her crops, how she had put months of effort into growing them, how I had no right to take them and sell them at the market. I stood silently, letting her dig her own hole deeper with every breath. It was almost entertaining watching her try to frame herself as the victim when she had been the one who had violated my property, used my resources, and assumed ownership of something that had never belonged to her. Her face turned redder as she realized I wasn't arguing back. My silence unsettled her. When she finally stopped for a breath, I stepped forward slowly, deliberately, and pointed toward the clear "No Trespassing" sign nailed to my fence. The same sign that had been there long before I had left town. She blinked, following my gesture, her lips parting like she wanted to protest, but couldn't quite find the words. I could see the gears turning in her mind, desperately searching for an angle to twist this in her favor. But the truth was too clear for her to distort. She had no legal claim, no justification, and no excuse. She tried to shift her tactics, her voice softening slightly as she insisted she had only done it because the land was going to waste, that she had taken care of it while I was gone, and that somehow should be grateful for what she had done. The sheer boldness made me shake my head. If she had truly been concerned about the land, she could have asked. Instead, she had assumed she could take without permission, and then throw a fit when her plan backfired. When it became clear that I wasn't going to be swayed by her self-pity, her fury flared once more. She warned me that I had made a big mistake, that she wasn't going to let this go with one final glare. She spun around and stormed back toward her house, slamming her door so hard that the sound echoed across the open fields. I watched her go, knowing this wasn't over yet. Karen wasn't the type to admit failure easily. If she couldn't take me down with words, she would try something else. And I was right. By midday, trouble arrived in the form of a police cruiser pulling up to my property. I stood at my porch, arms crossed, watching as an officer stepped out, adjusting his belt as he made his way toward me. He looked calm, professional. But the moment he opened his notepad, I already knew what was coming. Karen had filed the complaint. She had spun the story into something exaggerated, claiming that I had stolen her livelihood, that I had taken crops she had grown with her own 2 hands, that I had ruined months of her hard work. The officer asked for my side of the story, and I didn't hesitate. I laid it all out. The trespassing, the unauthorized use of my land, the sign she had put up, the prepacked crates of vegetables she had been preparing for sale. When I pulled out my phone and showed him the photos I had taken before I harvested the crops, proof of her claiming my land as her own, the officer's expression changed. I didn't have to say much more after that. He took notes, nodded, and finally closed his notepad with a sigh. From the look on his face, I could tell that he already knew what this was. A bitter neighbor trying to hide her mistake by dragging someone else down with her. He informed me that no laws had been broken on my end. The land was mine, the crops were mine by default, and Karen had no case to stand on. He would file the report, but there was nothing further to pursue. As he drove away, I glanced toward Karen's house. Her blinds fluttered slightly, as if she had been watching, waiting to see if her little trick had worked. When she realized it hadn't, the blinds snapped shut. I chuckled under my breath, knowing full well that her failure would be eating her alive. She had tried to use the system against me, hoping to twist the law in her favor, but in the end the facts had spoken for themselves. By the time the sun set, I had no doubt that she was planning her next move. But it didn't matter. Every attempt she made only dug her deeper into a trap she couldn't climb out of. I had won the first round, and I was more than ready for whatever came next. The next morning, just as I expected, Karen made her final move. A truck pulled up near my property and 2 men in formal suits stepped out, walking toward my house with legal documents in hand. Without hesitation, I opened the door, took the papers and scanned them. A lawsuit. Karen was suing me for theft, damages and emotional distress, claiming that my actions had financially ruined her and humiliated her publicly. She demanded compensation, likely expecting I would surrender under pressure, but she had no idea that I was more than ready for this. That afternoon I met with my lawyer, who barely contained his laughter as he read through her allegations. No contract, no lease, no case. Legally, anything grown on my property belonged to me, and Karen's actions made it clear she had trespassed and used my land without permission. Not only was she destined to fail, but I now had a reason to countersue for damages. When the court date arrived, Karen sat stiffly across from me, trying to maintain her demeanor. A lawyer presented the undeniable evidence: photos of her signs, irrigation systems, even town vendors who overheard her claiming ownership of my land. Her lawyer tried arguing she had invested labor and resources, but the judge rejected it almost immediately. No permission meant no rights. Within minutes, the case was over. Karen not only lost, but she was ordered to pay my legal fees. As I walked out of the courtroom, relief washed over me. It was over. Karen had tried everything: stealing, lying, and manipulating the system. But in the end, she had nothing to gain. Over the next few weeks, she stopped engaging with the neighbors. Her usual arrogance replaced with quiet humiliation. Not long after, "For sale" sign appeared in front of her house. Defeated and disgraced, she had finally accepted her defeat. With her gone, life returned to normal. My land was mine again, free of interference. I reinforced my fences, put up new security cameras, and ensured that no one would try to claim what wasn't theirs ever again. The best part? Karen had done all the work, but in the end, I was the only one who profited. As I stood at the edge of my field, looking over the land that had finally been restored to me, a deep sense of satisfaction settled in. Justice had been served.